She took in a wounded father and blind child, then found a dangerous secret. The blizzard tearing across the Appalachian Range didn't just bring a bone-chilling cold, it brought the sound of total annihilation. The wind howled through rocky crevices, battering the timber walls of the lone cabin atop Blackwood Mountain like a beast trying to reclaim land stolen by men. Inside, Elena Vance stood before the hearth, her thin but wiry hands hovering over the flickering flames. The orange glow cast shadows across her angular face and eyes the color of burnt-out ashes, the eyes of someone who had looked at death too many times to still be afraid of the dark. It had been 3 years since she walked away from the FBI forensics lab at Quantico. 3 years since her husband Mark's car went over a cliff in a wreck the police file labeled loss of control due to weather. But her crime scene instincts told her it was a textbook professional hit. Elena had chosen this peak as her sanctuary, not to run away but to protect her father's final legacy, over 1,000 acres of old-growth forest that resource corporations were dying to get their hands on. Beneath that ancient soil lay a rare mineral deposit, and she was the only wall between their greed and the stillness of the wild. Elena picked up the copper kettle, intending to steep some herbal tea, when a sound rang out. Thump, thump, thump. 3 sharp, urgent knocks tore through the roar of the wind. Elena froze. Her hand stayed on the kettle, but her eyes darted to the gun rack above the mantel. At this altitude, in the middle of a Category 5 storm, nobody showed up unless they were at the end of their rope, or extremely dangerous. She set down the kettle and stepped lightly across the hardwood floor her father had polished 30 years ago. She grabbed her Remington 870 shotgun, flicking the safety off with practiced ease. Elena wasn't one for violence, but she knew that on this mountain, sometimes the only law came out of the business end of a barrel. She pressed her ear against the thick oak door. Help. Please. A choked voice, shredded by the wind. The girl. My daughter doesn't have much time. It was a man's voice, but it carried the tremor of a soul who'd reached the breaking point. Elena took a deep breath, lowering the muzzle but keeping her finger on the trigger. She threw the bolt. The fury of the storm immediately rushed in, bringing a whiteout of snow and a soul-crushing cold that sent the room's temperature plummeting. Before her stood a tall, staggering figure. The man wore an expensive designer coat, now tattered and frozen stiff. In his arms was a small bundle, a child. "Get in! Move!" Elena shouted over the gale. The man crossed the threshold and collapsed onto the floor the moment Elena slammed the door shut. He didn't give a damn about himself, focusing only on shielding the child from the hardwood. Elena quickly set the gun aside and knelt by them. "Hey, can you hear me?" She tapped the man's cheek. He opened his eyes. They were a deep blue, but his pupils were blown wide from shock. "Maya, save Maya," he croaked before his head went limp. Elena immediately turned her attention to the child. She was a girl about 7 years old, her small face pale as a sheet, lips turning a bruised purple. Elena pressed her ear to the girl's chest. The heartbeat was faint and sluggish. Severe hypothermia. She scooped the girl up, placing her near the hearth, but not too close to avoid thermal shock, then went back to drag the man onto the fur rug. As she peeled off the man's stiff coat to check his breathing, her hand brushed something warm and tacky. Blood. His light blue dress shirt was stained a deep crimson at the left shoulder. Elena narrowed her eyes. With 10 years of experience working autopsies and crime scenes, she recognized it instantly. A gunshot wound from behind, downward angle, likely from a close-range semi-auto handgun. This wasn't an accident, she muttered, her professional instincts kicking into high gear. She stood up, ran to the back room for her medical kit and a stack of warm blankets. Elena began the fight against the Reaper. First was Maya. She gently stripped the girl's soaked clothes using warm towels to rub her skin to jumpstart circulation, then wrapped her in a backup electric blanket. Once the child's breathing evened out, Elena turned to the man. She used shears to rip away the shirt. The slug was still buried in his shoulder right under the collarbone. If she didn't get it out, infection and blood loss would finish him before daybreak. Elena took a long breath. pulled a bottle of stiff bourbon from the shelf and poured it over her scalpel and her hands. "I'm sorry, but this is gonna sting," she said, even though she knew he couldn't hear her. In that isolated cabin, amidst the screaming Appalachian storm, Elena Vance performed field surgery with the precision of a top-tier medical examiner. Every movement was cold and decisive. When the metal slug dropped into the copper tray with a sharp clink, Elena let out a breath. She quickly sutured the wound and bandaged it up. Once they were stabilized, Elena cleared away the bloody galls. That's when she noticed the man's coat lying on the floor. Something heavy fell out of the inner pocket. It was a portable hard drive, a matte black titanium casing, with military encryption symbols she'd seen on NSA agents before. Beside it was a crocodile skin wallet. She flipped it open. The ID read, Julian Sterling. The name made Elena stop dead in her tracks. Sterling. There weren't many people in New York with that last name who weren't tied to the Sterling Financial Group, the titan holding the economic jugular of the entire Northeast. If this really was Julian Sterling, the sole heir to that empire, what the hell was he doing in the middle of nowhere with a bullet in his shoulder? Elena looked out the window. Through the thick frost, she saw flashlights sweeping through the night from the base of the mountain. They moved fast, in an arc the movement of professional headhunters. She realized she hadn't just opened her door to two people, but to a political and criminal storm far more terrifying than the whiteout outside. Elena turned back to look at Maya, who was drifting in a deep sleep. The girl's eyes were shut tight, and Elena suddenly noticed a detail she'd missed. The girl hadn't reacted to the harsh light of her flashlight. Those eyes, the girl was blind. An injured father, a blind child, a hard drive full of national secrets, and a team of assassins closing in. Elena Vance gripped the stock of her shotgun. "Welcome to Blackwood Mountain, Julian Sterling," she whispered, her gray eyes burning with cold-blooded resolve. "City law doesn't exist up here, but Elena Vance's justice sure does." She cut all the lights, leaving only the dying embers in the hearth. Elena stepped to the west window, which overlooked the only road up the peak. She knew Silas Thorne, the local heavy, who had been trying to jump her claim, had to be involved. He was the only one who knew these woods well enough to lead those outsiders. The storm showed no sign of letting up, and this life-and-death game was just getting started. Elena checked her shell bag, the cold feel of the brass pressing into her palm. She wasn't just a forensic tech who talked to corpses anymore. Tonight she'd have to protect the living, even if it meant burning down the piece she'd spent 3 years building. From the bottom of the slope, the steady drone of snowmobiles tore through the wind. Elena counted, at least 3 of them. 6 men. She was alone with 1 gun and 2 unconscious hostages. But Elena had one advantage. They didn't. She knew every tree and every rock on this mountain. And more importantly, she was a woman with nothing left to lose. She stepped over to Julian, checking his pulse again. He was starting to run a fever, mumbling nonsense about trials, evidence, and father. Elena placed cold cloth on his forehead. "Sleep tight, Julian," she said softly. "When you wake up, we'll see if that empire of yours is worth us dying for." Outside, the first flashlight beam swept across the wooden fence in the yard. Elena Vance stayed low, crawling toward her prepped blind. The flare's crimson glare washed over the snow, turning the front yard into a surreal, lethal stage. Elena Vance pressed her back against the timber wall, her breathing steady so faint it practically dissolved into the wind. Through a slit in the window, reinforced with steel bars hidden inside the wooden frame, she watched the silhouettes of 3 men scrambling back after tripping the flare trap near the fence. These weren't amateurs. As soon as the flare ignited, they didn't bolt. They fanned out, dropping into the snow with submachine guns trained on the house. One of them signaled with his hand a sharp tactical gesture of special ops training. Inside, Julian Sterling let out a low groan. The fever was starting to wreck him. Elena moved like a shadow to his side, clamping one hand over his mouth and pressing the other firmly on his shoulder. "Shut it, if you want your girl to live," she hissed into his ear, her voice as cold as the ice outside. Julian's blue eyes went wide, locking onto hers in the dark. Lucidity returned to him with a painful jolt. He glanced at Maya, seeing her still tucked under the blankets, her breath weak but steady. He gave a sharp nod. Elena let go, but she didn't pull away. "Who are they?" she whispered, barely audible. Julian swallowed hard, the taste of blood and bourbon still burning his throat. "My uncle's private security detail. Silas Thorne is bird-dogging for them. They aren't here to bring me in. They want this." He pointed a shaking hand toward his coat on the chair where the hard drive sat silent. "That's the blacklist. Every judge and politician the Sterling Group has had in their pocket for 20 years. If that thing gets burned, justice in this country goes back to the Stone Age." Elena gripped the stock of her Remington. She used to believe in a system until it turned its back on her husband's death. Now, standing before a man carrying the last shred of transparency, a fire she thought had gone cold started to flicker back to life. "I'm not letting them touch it," Elena said. "Not as a promise, but as a statement of fact." Suddenly, a strange sound cut through. Not the wind, not a footstep, a faint, rhythmic whirring. Maya, the blind girl on the rug, bolted upright. Though her eyes saw nothing, she turned her head toward the east wall. "Daddy, I hear bees," she said, her voice trembling. Lots of bees outside the wall. Elena's face went pale. She knew those weren't bees. Those were micro-drones, using thermal imaging to scout. They were pinging the targets inside through the wooden walls. "Get down, now!" Elena lunged, grabbing both Julian and Maya and hauling them under the heavy oak coffee table bolted near the hottest spot in the room, meant to scramble the drone's heat sensors. Right then, the shots rang out. Not thunderous blasts, but the muffled fwits of suppressed fire. Armor-piercing rounds shredded the oak walls, slamming into the stone backing of the fireplace. They were shooting by drone guidance. Elena knew she couldn't just sit there and take it. She pulled an old gas mask in a small canvas bag from under the table. "Get this on the girl," she told Julian, handing over the mask. "And don't you dare move until I get back." "What are you doing?" Julian grabbed her arm, panicked. "I'm gonna go swat some bees." Elena crawled across the floor, moving toward the hatch that led to the woodshed basement. She vanished into the darkness of the cellar, just as a flashbang tossed through the window exploded in the living room, with a blinding white light and a skull-splitting bang. Outside, the snow was still coming down in sheets, killing visibility. 3 assassins began their approach to the porch. The lead man, with a jagged scar running down his neck, signaled his team to breach. But the second his boot hit the first wooden step, a tripwire thin as silk snapped. Snap! A heavy-duty bear trap Elena used for winter predators slammed shut from beneath a dusting of snow. The jagged steel teeth bit deep into the assassin's shin, pulverizing his tibia. His scream was swallowed by the gale, but his partners immediately opened fire, spraying and praying into the void. From behind the woodpile at the side of the house, Elena appeared like a wraith. She didn't use her gun, yet no sense giving away her position with a muzzle flash. Instead, she held a modified slingshot and steel ball bearings coated in a potent sedative, the kind she used to knock out grizzlies without killing them. Whiz! Whiz! 2 bearings slammed into the exposed necks of the remaining men. The neurotoxin hit almost instantly. They stumbled, their guns hitting the snow before they went down like felled timber. Elena stepped toward the man caught in the bear trap. He was clawing for a combat knife to cut the wire, his eyes wild. Elena leveled the Remington at his head. "Tell me where Silas Thorne is." The assassin spat blood into the snow, a grimace on his face. "You're dead meat, bitch. Silas is with the sheriff. They're coming with a warrant. You aren't just fighting us, you're fighting the state." Elena narrowed her eyes. She knew this was the Achilles heel. Silas Thorne wasn't just a local kingpin. He planted his people throughout local law enforcement. If they showed up with badges on their chests, her shooting to protect Julian would be spun as assaulting an officer. Right then, in the distance, the headlights of heavy-duty SUVs began climbing the slope. Sirens wailed, echoing through the timber. "Damn it," Elena cursed under her breath. She couldn't kill these men. That would make her a real criminal in the eyes of the public. She ran back inside, hauling Julian and Maya up. "We have to move now. My father's old escape tunnel leads out to the frozen falls." Julian looked at her, sweat pouring down his face from the pain. "My shoulder." and Maya. She can't move fast enough. You have to, Elena said, quickly stuffing the hard drive into a waterproof pouch and strapping it to her chest. The system you're trying to save is being used as a weapon to kill you. If you die here, this drive stays buried forever. Mark, my husband, died because of a script just like this. I'm not letting history repeat itself. Maya grabbed Elena's hand, her small grip trembling but trusting. Miss Elena, I hear dogs. They've got hounds. Elena froze. Hounds in a blizzard were a death sentence for fugitives. They'd track the scent, no matter how much snow fell. She looked around the kitchen, her eyes landing on a jar of cayenne pepper and a bottle of white vinegar. Julian, take this pepper, trail it behind us in the tunnel. I'll deal with the dogs. They slipped into the secret hatcher, cramped, damp passage Elena's father had dug during the Cold War as a fallout shelter. Just as they bolted the hatch from below, the sound of the front door being kicked in thundered above them. Blackwood County Sheriff's Department. Drop your weapons. Sheriff Miller's voice boomed, authoritative but crooked as a dog's hind leg. Down in the tunnel, Elena led the way, using a flashlight covered in red cloth to dull the glare. Julian followed, one hand on Elena's shoulder, the other leading Maya. The air was thin and smelled of damp earth. Julian, Elena whispered when they reached a fork in the tunnel. Why didn't you just take this to the feds? Because the head of the FBI's New York office is the cousin of the uncle who shot me, Julian replied bitterly. In my world, loyalty is bought with checks that have too many zeros. I could only trust someone outside the system. Someone like you. Elena stayed silent. The trust of a stranger was a heavy burden to bear once again. She knew that the moment they stepped out of the exit at the falls, there would be no turning back. Barking erupted right above the hatch they'd just left. The canines had the scent. Elena signaled Julian to keep moving. She paused, pulling a homemade smoke grenade filled with pepper powder and irritants from her bag. She rigged it to a pull string right at the exit. Hope you boys like it extra spicy, she muttered. When they pushed open the camouflaged stone door to the outside, the freeze of the frozen waterfall hit them like a wall. Massive ice pillars hung down like nature's fangs, shimmering under a pale moon. Elena looked down into the deep valley below, where the frozen creek bed formed a slick, treacherous path. We're taking the ledge, Elena pointed to a narrow trail barely wide enough for one person. It's the only way to lose the tails without leaving a clear track. Maya suddenly stopped, her ears perking up. Daddy, I hear a chopper. In the sky, a pitch-black helicopter with no markings hovered low over the pines, heading straight for their position. A thermal spotlight began to sweep the cliffside. Run! Elena barked, pulling Maya into the shadow of the rock crevices, just as the white beam of the chopper swept over their position by a hair's breadth. The chopper's spotlight swept the cliffside, leaving sickly white streaks across the permafrost. Elena shoved Julian and Maya deep into a narrow rock fissure, where hanging icicles formed a natural curtain to mask them from above. The rhythmic thumping of the rotor blades slicing through the thin air sent violent vibrations through Julian's chest, making him wince in agony. He gnashed his teeth to keep from crying out as his shoulder wound began to seep through the bandages again. We can't stay here long, Elena whispered, her breath blooming into a white cloud. That chopper's packing military-grade thermal. If they hover over these rocks long enough, our body heat is going to pop up like a flare. She timed the sweep. Every 15 seconds, the bird pivoted for a fresh pass. That gave them a 15-second window to stay alive. Elena gripped Maya's hand. The girl was shivering, but hadn't shed a single tear. There was something heartbreaking, yet tough as nails about the blind child's silence. Listen to me, Maya. I'm going to count to 3, and we're going to bolt for those pines on the left. You gotta trust me, okay? Maya gave a tiny nod. As the beam slid past the outcrop, Elena hissed, Move! They lunged through the knee-deep snow, with Julian staggering in the rear. Just as they vanished into the dense old-growth timber, the spotlight slammed back onto their old hiding spot, cooking the empty rock. Elena led them across a dry creek bed, using the exposed stones to avoid leaving deep tracks. After nearly an hour of navigating the pitch black, they hit the outskirts of Blackwood from behind the abandoned warehouses. A grey, dismal dawn began to bleed over the ridges, but it brought no sense of peace. Blackwood looked like a frozen still life, silent, cold, and crawling with eyes hidden behind drawn curtains. "That's Sheriff Miller's office," Julian pointed toward a red brick building in the center. "We have to go in. If I go public with my identity, they won't dare smoke me in front of the locals." Elena grabbed his arm, yanking him back behind an old flatbed truck. "You still don't get it, do you, Julian? Miller isn't just on Silas Thorne's payroll. He's a cog in the machine your uncle bought and paid for. You walk in there, and you'll disappear in a justified shooting before you even hit a holding cell." Right then, a motorcade of sleek black SUVs, led by Silas Thorne's armored Cadillac, rolled into the town square. 3 county cruisers rode shotgun. Silas stepped out, his high-end wool suits looking completely out of place in the rugged mountain town. Miller hopped out of a cruiser, nodding to Silas like an errand boy. "He's got a warrant for me," Julian whispered, staring at the paper in Miller's hand. "Claiming I kidnapped my own daughter and murdered 2 guards back in New York." He's flipped the script. Elena squinted through the gap. She saw Silas on his cell, looking both smug and impatient. It clicked. "Maya, back in the tunnel. Did you bring that little red bag?" "Yes. It's in Daddy's suitcase," Maya whispered. Elena turned to Julian, her face hardening. "GPS chip. I dropped the ball. Sterling Group definitely tagged Maya's gear in case she wandered off or got snatched. That's how the chopper burned us so fast." Julian frantically tore open the bag, digging through Maya's toys. Sure enough, buried in the stitching of a small teddy bear was a microtransmitter, blinking a faint blue light. "Get rid of it." Julian went to hurl it away. "No, wait." Elena stopped him, a bold play forming in her mind. "Give it to me. We're going to use their own greed to buy us some air." She took the bear and lashed it to the undercarriage of a logging truck prepped to head across the state line into Virginia. The engine roared to life, carrying the ghost signal out of town. Silas and the deputies immediately got a hit on their tablets, piling into their rigs to chase a ghost in the opposite direction. With the square temporarily clear, Elena hustled them into the town post office. It was the only place she still trusted. The postmistress was a woman in her 80s, a dear friend of Elena's father who hated Silas Thorne's land-grabbing guts. "Martha, I need a secure line," Elena said the moment they stepped inside. Martha took one look at the bleeding Julian and little Maya. Without a word, she pointed to the back room. "Watch your back, Elena. Miller had his goons tossing this place just this morning." Elena picked up the receiver, punching in a number she'd memorized, but never thought she'd dial again. "Special Prosecutor's Office. Go ahead," a steady male voice answered. "This is Elena Vance, ID code 4.2. Put me through to Marcus Stone." There was a long silence. Marcus Stone was her late husband's old partner, the only guy in the DOJ who had kept digging into Mark's case for the last 3 years. "Elena, you're alive?" Marcus's voice cracked. "Listen, Marcus, I'm short on time. I've got Julian Sterling and the hard drive with the Sterling Black Book. The entire legal system in West Virginia is compromised. Silas Thorne is hunting us under color of law. I need a DOJ strike team for federal intervention." "Jesus, Elena, Julian Sterling's been off the grid for 3 days. New York is going sideways. Look, I'm sending my team now, but it'll take at least 4 hours to get bird's eye on your mountain. Can you hold the line?" "I'll try." "But Marcus, don't trust a single report from local law. If you see me shooting, it's because the Moor is dead up here." Elena hung up. She looked at Julian. He was slumped against the wall, haggard from blood loss, but with a flicker of hope in his eyes. 4 hours, she said. "We need a hole to crawl into where they can't use tech to find us." They slipped out the back, weaving through alleyways to double back up the mountain. Elena led them to an old coal mine abandoned since the 50s, buried deep in the limestone behind the frozen falls. It was a labyrinth of dark tunnels where the iron ore in the rock would jam every radio signal and thermal sensor they had. But as they reached the mine entrance, the sirens wailed again, this time from the pine forest. The logging truck had been intercepted faster than she'd banked on. Silas Thorne wasn't a fool. He'd smelled the distraction. Silas stepped out from the tree line, bullhorn in hand. Miller and a line of deputies stood ready, rifles chambered. "Elena Vance." Silas' voice echoed off the cliffs. "You're a good citizen. Don't let your stubbornness turn you into a kidnapping accomplice. Hand over Julian and the kid, and I promise you won't have to answer for those 2 bodies at your house last night." Elena stood her ground at the mine entrance, her Remington 870 held steady. She didn't look at Silas. She looked straight at Miller, the man wearing the silver star on his chest. "Miller, you swore an oath to protect the people." Elena yelled back, "Julian Sterling is a key DOJ witness. You're aiding and abetting a hit squad. That's treason." Miller flinched, his eyes flickering with doubt for a split second. He knew Elena didn't blow smoke. But Silas stepped up, leaning in to whisper in Miller's ear. Miller's face immediately went cold. He leveled his rifle. "That's no witness, that's a dangerous fugitive," Miller declared. "Open fire." A hail of lead chewed up the mine entrance. Eleanor shoved Julian and Maya deep into the darkness as bullets shredded the rotted timber. She fired one warning shot into the air to force them to hit the dirt, then dove inside, triggering a small demo charge she'd rigged in the archway years ago for an emergency. Boom! The earth groaned as the entrance collapsed, sealing the mine shut. Total darkness swallowed them. Elena clicked on her headlamp, the beam illuminating Julian's terrified face. "Are we trapped?" he asked, his voice shaking. "No, we're in our stronghold," Elena replied flatly. "This mine has a vent that exits at the fire lookout on the peak. We'll wait for Marcus there." They began the trek through the bowels of the mountain. The air was tight, thick with sulfur and damp. Maya suddenly stopped, pressing her ear to the rock. "Ms. Elena, they aren't giving up. I hear metal hitting stone. They're using backhoes to dig in." Elena felt a chill. Silas Thorne didn't just want the drive, he wanted to wipe every trace of them off this mountain. He was going all in before the feds could show up. "Pick up the pace," Elena urged. In the darkness of the mine, the truth about Sterling finally came out. Julian spoke of the nights he watched his uncle, Arthur Sterling, sign off on payouts to cartels to crush strikes, and how Markelena's husband had been murdered because he stumbled onto a Sterling money laundering account in West Virginia. "Your husband found the truth, Elena. It wasn't an accident. He died to keep our empire in the shadows," Julian said, his voice thick. Elena stopped dead, her heart tightened. For 3 years she'd lived in self-denial, telling herself it was an accident to dull the pain. Now the truth was laid bare like an open wound. She wasn't just saving Julian. She was finishing Mark's work. "Then tonight," Elena said, her voice vibrating with a terrifying strength, "we end it. For Mark, and for everyone they stepped on." The faint light of the fire lookout began to appear at the end of the shaft. But as they stepped out onto the summit, they didn't see the DOJ's planes. Instead, 3 black Sterling Group choppers were already parked on the clearing, their searchlights pinned right on them. Silas Thorne had leapfrogged them with the birds. He stood there, handgun in hand, a wicked grin on his face under the moonlight. "End of the line, Elena. Hand over the drive, or I'll toss this kid off the ledge right in front of you." An assassin grabbed Maya, dragging her to the very edge of Blackwood's abyss. Elena felt her blood turn to ice, but her finger stayed steady on the trigger. The wind howling through the iron bars of the fire lookout created a gruesome dirge, sounding like the wailing of fallen souls on this cursed land. The blinding searchlight from the chopper behind Silas Thorne made Elena squint, but her Remington stayed rock-steady, zeroed in right on his heart. Maya was hoisted up by one hand by the hitman Cale, the one with the jagged scar on his neck. The girl's small legs dangled over the abyss, with 100-foot drops of the Appalachians waiting below. "Drop the piece, Elena," Silas repeated, his voice stripped of its fake elegance and dripping with bloodlust. "I'm fresh out of patience. The drive, or the kid's life. You know I'm good for it." Julian Sterling collapsed into the snow, his shoulders hitching. "Don't, Silas, please. I'll give it to you." "Elena, for God's sake, give it to him." Elena cut a glance at Julian, then back to Maya. The blind girl wasn't crying. Her small face was tilted up, ears twitching as if tracking a signal in the wind. Elena remembered what she told Maya back in the mine. In the dark, you don't need eyes to see. You just need to listen to the breath of the mountain. Julian, stow it, Elena snapped. She didn't lower her weapon. Silas, you think I'm going to trust the man who murdered my husband? You get the drive and all three of us end up as loose ends. That's the Sterling way, isn't it? Silas gave a cold smirk, his finger tightening on the trigger. You're sharp, I'll give you that. But being a smartass usually leads to a short life. Right then, a heavy thud echoed from the dense pines behind the lookout. It wasn't a chopper. It was the whistle of heavy metal cutting air. Thwack! A long ebony bolt, hand-carved and steel-tipped, tore through Kyle's shoulder. The impact was so violent it threw him clear off the ledge. Maya tumbled onto the soft snow right at the brink. "Light 'em up!" Silas screamed. All hell broke loose. Elena didn't hesitate. She squeezed the trigger. The Remington's roar cracked the air, the slug slamming into a backup fuel drum sitting next to the nearest chopper. A massive fireball erupted, illuminating Blackwood's summit and blowing Silas and his goons back. "To the tower, now!" Elena bellowed, scooping up Maya and shoving Julian toward the rusted iron stairs of the old lookout. From the tree-lined shadows, a massive figure stepped out. It was Moses, the old neighbor the townies called Crazy Mo. But he didn't look crazy now. He was decked out in snow camo, wielding a heavy hunting bow with a quiver full of handmade bolts. Without a word, he drew and fired, every arrow dropping a hitman trying to storm the tower. "Get to the top floor!" Elena barked to Julian as they scrambled up the iron steps. At the top, the wind hit so hard the tower swayed violently. Elena scrambled into an observation post. She saw Miller and the local deputies starting their climb up the trail. Below, Silas had scrambled up, frantically ordering the remaining chopper to lift off and shred the lookout from the air. "Julian, take this." Elena handed him a sidearm she'd lifted from a hitman in the mine. "If they breach, you know what to do." Julian looked at the gun, his hands shaking before they finally clamped shut. Seeing his daughter nearly die had triggered a protective streak in the white-collar mogul. "I won't let them touch her again." The Sterling chopper began circling the tower. The door gunner opened up, brass raining down as lead shredded the glass and timber walls. Elena pinned Maya to the steel floor. "Miss Elena, I hear another engine." Maya screamed over the gale. "It's huge, coming from the east." Elena looked at the horizon. The strobing red and blue lights of 3 Black Hawks were screaming toward them. The DOJ strike team, Marcus Stone, had arrived. But Silas saw it too. He knew his clock was ticking. He snatched a sniper rifle from one of his men, aiming straight for Elena on the tower. "This is on you, bitch," Silas hissed through gritted teeth. A shot tore the air. Elena felt a searing pain in her side and slumped to the floor. "Elena!" Julian lunged to cover her. "I'm good. Just a flesh wound," Elena grunted, her hand still white-knuckled around the hard drive. She saw Silas prepping for a second shot. Suddenly, from below, Moses stood tall in the crossfire. He ditched the bow. He pulled out a vintage sniper rifle from the World War era, the kind Elena's father used to own. He took a deep breath, the old hunter's eyes eerily calm in the middle of the war zone. Crack! The round punched through Silas' scope, taking him right between the eyes before he could pull the trigger. Silas Thorne crumpled into the snow, his eyes still wide with raw ambition and spite. In a heartbeat, DOJ fast rode down from the Black Hawks. Miller and the local deputies immediately ditched their guns, hitting the deck as they faced federal muzzles and emergency warrants. "Federal agents, nobody move." The megaphone boomed, drowning out the wind. Elena leaned against a steel pillar, watching the dark-clad agents swarm the summit and cuff the remaining shooters. Marcus Stone jumped out of a chopper, sprinting up the tower. "Elena, you're still with us." Marcus choked out when he saw his old friend. Elena gave a weak smile, handing the blood-stained drive to Marcus with a trembling hand. "Here, every bit of it, and the proof on Mark. Don't let it get buried again." Marcus took the drive, giving a grim nod. "I swear, Elena, justice is coming." Julian picked up Maya and walked to Elena's side. He looked at the woman who had saved their lives, who had turned this lonely peak into a fortress of truth. "Are you coming with us? We'll take care of you in D." See, Elena looked toward the dark pines emerging under the dawn, toward the smoking ruins of her home. She gave a small shake of her head. "The city isn't for me, Julian. This is my home. And now the vermin are finally gone." Maya reached out her small hands, touching Elena's face. She didn't see the blood or the scars. She only felt the warmth of a woman of integrity. "Miss Elena, can I come back to visit you later?" Elena took the girl's hand, pressing a light kiss to it. "Anytime, Maya. Blackwood Mountain will always have its door open for you." As the medevacs and federal birds began to lift off, carrying away the sinners and the witnesses, Elena stood with Moses by the wreckage. The snow had stopped. The winter sun began to gild the Appalachian peaks, signaling a fresh start. The system had been twisted, but in the end, it was set right by the grit of people who refused to break. Silas Thorne had met his reckoning, and human compassion had stared down bottomless greed and won. Elena Vance took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. She knew the road back would be long, but for the first time in 3 years, she felt her soul was finally in the clear. Inside courtroom number 4 of the Federal Supreme Court, the air held a heavy, solemn chill. Elena Vance sat in the front row of the gallery, her fingers tightly interlaced. Gone was the tattered gear, stained with snow and blood. In its place was a sharp, tailored black suit. Her ash-gray hair was pulled back into a neat bun, radiating the calm of someone who had walked through fire to find the truth. On the witness stand, Julian Sterling stood tall. His voice rang through the chamber, clear and steely. He was no longer the trembling man from the mine. "Your Honor, the hard drive I provided is more than just a list of numbers," Julian said, looking directly at Arthur Sterling, his uncle, who sat at the defense table with a gray, ashen face. "It's evidence of a systemic betrayal of the American justice system. Every name in there represents a bought verdict, a forced land seizure, or a life snuffed out to fuel the Sterling Group's expansion. That includes Mark Vance, an honest investigator, murdered because he believed in the law." Elena closed her eyes as a hot tear traced a path down her cheek. Finally, Mark's name was being spoken in the highest halls of power, not as an accident victim, but as a hero for justice. Marcus Stone, leading the prosecution, presented the forensic files Elena had spent the last 6 months quietly perfecting from her husband's old leads. The synergy of the financial data on the drive and the crime scene forensics formed a noose that tightened around the killers. "Justice may be late," Marcus concluded his argument, "but when it arrives, it must carry the power to sweep away the dark. In the name of the law, we ask for the maximum sentence for those who treated human life and the sanctity of the Constitution with such total contempt." When the jury declared Arthur Sterling and his associates guilty on all counts from money laundering to first-degree murder, a heavy silence gripped the room before exploding into frantic whispers. Arthur collapsed at the table, his mask of power completely shattered. Karma, it seemed, had finally found the right address, no matter how much snow it had to trek through. Leaving D.C. That same night, Elena didn't stick around for the victory parties. She drove through the night toward West Virginia. She needed the scent of pine and the rustle of the Appalachian wind more than the camera flashes of the press. As her truck climbed the familiar slope of Blackwood Mountain, Elena froze. Her cabin once burned to ash stood tall again. It was no longer a lonely, weathered shack. It was a fortress, built of fragrant cedar with massive glass windows facing the dawn. On the porch, Moses leaned against a timber pillar, his trusty hunting bow in hand. Beside him were dozens of Blackwood locals. These were the people Silas Thorne had stepped on, the ones Elena had indirectly saved by taking down the Sterling Empire. They had chipped in labor and lumber to rebuild her home while she was in Washington. "Welcome home, Elena," Moses said, a rare smile creasing his weathered face. "This peak needs its gatekeeper." Elena stepped out of the truck, her legs trembling with emotion. She saw Miller now serving a short sentence of community service for his negligence among the crowd, quietly helping move the last crates of wood. He bowed his head when he saw her, a genuine gesture of penance. The law had broken him, but the mercy of the community had given him a shot at a clean slate. Suddenly, a car pulled into the yard. Julian stepped out, leading Maya by the hand. The girl looked radiant in a floral summer dress. She was no longer wearing the sunglasses that hid her eyes. Following a surgery funded by a conservation trust Julian had just launched, she could now see faint, blurry shapes. "Miss Elena?" Maya let go of her father's hand, trotting toward her by the sound of her voice. Elena knelt, catching the girl in a tight embrace. Maya reached out to touch Elena's face, her eyes shimmering with life. "I can see you have hair the color of the clouds, just like I pictured." Julian stepped closer, looking at the new house and the crowd with deep admiration. "I used to think money could build anything, but looking at this, I finally get what real wealth looks like. Elena, I've moved all my sterling shares into a trust to permanently protect this stretch of the Appalachians. No corporation can touch it now. The law is finally on the side of the wild." Elena stood up, looking out over her neighbors, Julian and Maya, then up at the summit of Blackwood glowing under the golden afternoon sun. She knew the scar on Julian's shoulder and the hole in her heart for Mark would never truly vanish, but they weren't bleeding anymore. They were badges of honor from a hard-won victory. "The law is a sort of punishment," Elena whispered the words she'd once written in her journal, "but compassion and solidarity are the true shields of life." That night, a small celebration took place in the yard. Smoke drifted steadily from the new hearth, carrying the scent of pine and warm food. Moses told stories of Elena's father secrets of the mountains he'd kept a lifetime. Julian and Maya sat beside Elena, watching the Milky Way stretch across the sky like a river of light. Suddenly there was a knock at the gate. The group went quiet for a heartbeat. But this time, Elena didn't reach for her gun. She smiled, stood up, and opened the gate. It was just a courier with a small package from Marcus Stone. Inside was Mark's police badge, polished to a high shine, along with a handwritten note. "Justice has been served in full. Mark is definitely smiling." Elena looked out into the night. The storm from 6 months ago was a distant memory, replaced by a vibrant, peaceful summer. She knew that from now on, whenever a knock sounded on this mountain, it wouldn't bring death or fear. It would bring friends, new stories, and an unshakable faith in people. She took a deep breath of the mountain air, feeling a true sense of freedom in her veins. Blackwood Peak wasn't lonely anymore, because wherever truth and love reside, that place is home.